They journeyed for 6 months and 2,000 difficult miles. Wood and iron wheels rolling, bumping, grinding a passageway into half a continent, inching ever westward, west to the promised land, west to Oregon. In the early 1840s, Americans from all walks of life were restless. They had read the accounts of explorers and trappers who penetrated the western wilderness. Now pictures of a bountiful land, rich with fish and game, filled their heads. Fertile valleys, ripe for the plow, and land ready for the taking, seized their imaginations. A fever set in, an Oregon fever. It was fueled by discontent, with falling farm and crop prices, bank and business failures, and soaring unemployment. It was driven by an urge, a longing for fresh horizons, uncrowded surroundings, an opportunity to start anew. Each day, newspapers ran stories, opinions, and letters from Western travelers. Some were well-tempered, others bordered on the absurd.
Out in Oregon, the pigs are running around under the great acorn trees, round and fat and already cooked with knives and forks sticking in them. So you can just cut off a slice whenever you're hungry.
In 1844, presidential candidate James K. Polk promised to extend the boundaries of the Oregon country all the way to the 54th parallel, an area that included British-held territory. His campaign slogan, 5440 or fight, became the rallying cry for national expansion. The Oregon fever rose. Journalist John L. O'Sullivan added fuel to the fire by writing that it was America's manifest destiny to extend to the Pacific, a mission ordained by God, a notion that virtually ignored the existence of the Native Americans. The public embraced the concept, driven by patriotism, plagued with financial troubles, searching for a better life and an opportunity for free land. People's hearts and souls turned toward the setting sun.
They told him his family would all be killed by the Indians, or if we escaped the Indians, we would either starve to death or drown or be lost in the desert. But Father was not much of a hand to draw back after he put his hand to the plow, so he went ahead and made ready for the trip. Benjamin Franklin Bonney, 1845.
Preparations took months. Decisions were endless. The first order of business was a wagon. But not just any wagon. The old, bulky Conestoga wouldn't do, nor would the family farm wagon unless modified. This vehicle would have to be lighter, stronger, shorter, tough enough to withstand the torturous conditions and weather extremes of a 6-month journey across a raw landscape.
The wagon should be built on a wide track with a box between 22 and 24 inches high and about 11 feet long. Everything should be made out of well-seasoned wood. It should be fitted with a falling tongue. Tires should be not less than 1 3/4 inches wide and should be fastened on with bolts, not nails. The hoop should be no more than 5 feet from the bottom of the wagon box and covered with 2 thicknesses of heavy drilling.
Without any springs to soften the ride or brakes to avoid accidents, these wagons were nonetheless well suited to the rigors of the trail. Their billowing canvas tops reminded many of the sailing ships on which their ancestors had crossed the ocean so many years ago. And so they christened them prairie schooners. All manner of supplies were required for the long journey ahead, including spare wagon parts, tools, cooking utensils, bedding, clothing, and food. Plenty of food.
For each adult, 200 pounds of flour, 300 pounds of pilot bread, 75 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of rice, 5 pounds of coffee, 2 pounds of tea, 25 pounds of sugar, half a bushel of dried beans, a bushel of dried fruit, 2 pounds of saleratus, 10 pounds of salt, and a half a bushel of cornmeal.
Over 1.5 tons of provisions crammed into these small wagons demanded strong animals to pull them. Horses were seldom used on the Oregon Trail. Oxen and mules were preferred. Oxen were the first choice for their stamina, their ability to subsist on prairie grasses, and the general lack of interest by the natives in stealing them. They were cheaper than mules, and in an emergency, you could always eat them. In 1840, the population of the United States was 17 million. Missouri was the frontier, one of America's newest states. Out in the Oregon country, Americans numbered a mere 400 souls. In between, there was nothing but wilderness. Any who entered this strange, often hostile land were true foreigners, immigrants. Today, most of us take moving to a new community in stride. It might be difficult, but we know we can always stay in touch with friends and relatives by phone or a quick trip back. In the 1840s, goodbyes were different. It was farewell to family and friends, to a comfortable home, to security and safety, perhaps forever. Most immigrants never saw who and what they left behind ever again. This did not dissuade them. Journeying to the nearest river port, they booked passage on steamboats at $6 for a cabin, $4 for the deck. Down the Ohio and up the Mississippi they sailed until they reached settlements on the Missouri River. Jumping off places, they were called, for towns like Westport, Council Bluffs, and St. Joe's were the last bastions of civilization before the wilderness. But one town in particular echoed the state of mind of many a pioneer: Independence. Independence, Missouri in the 1840s was rowdy, tough, and tolerant of most anything. Independence Landing lay cluttered with cargo and equipment. As the wagons rolled off the sternwheelers, oxen strained up the steep grade to Independence Square. Here, dozens of blacksmith shops hammered out iron shoes and fittings 18 hours a day. Wheelwrights, wagon makers, and outfitting shops catered to the wagon train trade.
Noise and confusion reigned supreme. Traders, trappers, and immigrants filled the streets and stores. All were in a hurry, jostling one another, and impatient to get through with their business. William G. Johnston, 1849.
When fights broke out or laws were violated, frontier justice prevailed at the log courthouse. It was often a stern judgment. At Independence Jail, everyone from minor offenders to hardened criminals were locked up, the most notable being Frank James, brother of the notorious outlaw Jesse James. Back in town, aspiring overlanders milled about seeking to form or join wagon trains, eager to embark on a journey of a lifetime. Timing was everything. Nature gave the signal when the prairie grasses reached 4 inches high and the mud began to harden, usually mid-April to May. Those who left earlier risked a shortage of forage for the team animals. Any who departed later faced certain snow in the Blue Mountains of the Oregon country. That left about 6 months. 6 months to travel 2,000 miles. Many wives pregnant or with small children were fearful of the journey and the harm that could come to their families. Their husbands, on the other hand, were exhilarated by the prospect, feeling the pull of a great quest. Single men and women Teenagers and children were consumed with excitement and curiosity. Most were totally innocent to the dangers that lie ahead. Others understood the risks and the potential rewards. At first, the caravan followed the old Santa Fe Trail past the Missouri border. About 3 days out of Independence, the trail split. The Santa Fe Trail continued in a southwest direction. The road to Oregon headed northwest. It was spring. Many immigrants felt as if they were on holiday. Farmers, normally plowing stubborn fields at this time of the year, were energized. Young people frolicked in the prairie grass, picking wildflowers. The trip would be easy, a pleasant stroll in the meadow. Surely it would be in Oregon before they knew it. This enthusiasm soon wore thin. Even with all their careful planning, most overlanders were altogether unprepared for life on the trail. Their wagons were overloaded with personal treasures. Their wilderness skills were lacking or non-existent. Many had meager cash reserves for restocking provisions. Consequently, they were plagued by hardship, pain, and ultimately tragedy. They had a saying for this bad luck, these accidents. They called it meeting the elephant.
Mr. Harvey's little boy, Richard, 8 years old, went to get into the wagon and fell off the tongue. The wheels run over him and smashed his head and killed him stone dead. He never moved. Absalom Hardin, 1847.
The elephant visited in many forms. Sometimes rifles discharged in the bouncing wagons, killing or maiming innocent victims. People would wander off into the wilds, never to be seen again. Animals often crushed or gored careless travelers. Men, women, and children drowned in the perilous river crossings. But the most feared encounter with the elephant was a malady called cholera. Cholera epidemics took a heavy toll along the trail, killing thousands. The disease spread quickly due to poor sanitary conditions at overused campsites, where human and animal wastes polluted the water supply. Cholera begins with intense stomach pains. The body quickly dehydrates through diarrhea, vomiting, and acute sweating. Skin becomes inelastic. It wrinkles and glazes over with a bluish cast. Cholera wasn't always fatal, but it could kill fast. A person who contracted it in the morning might be in the grave by evening. Bodies were often buried right on the trail. The wagons rolled right over the sad tombs to obscure the smell. For immigrants had seen all too many human bones scattered along the trail. Graves of loved ones dug up by scavenging wolves. By the time the Western immigration dwindled in the 1870s, there would be one grave for every 80 yards of the trail. Over 30,000 lives, all fallen to the elephant. Water, or lack of it, influenced every turn, every bend, every ascent and descent on the Oregon Trail. The immigrants could carry only so much water in their wagons, so they sought out overnight camps with a good water source. Water for cooking, for washing, for bathing, for quenching thirsts both human and animal. River courses were followed for hundreds of miles, not only for their water. They were often the easiest passage through an otherwise harsh landscape. But the rivers were a curse as well as a blessing. Each had to be crossed, and sometimes recrossed many times over. The Kansas, Little and Big Blue, Red and Black Vermilion rivers were the first of many. Some crossings were shallow enough to simply ford or roll right across. For others, the wagons were unloaded, the wheels removed and stowed, the wagon boxes caulked and sealed. The entire package was then floated across. Out in the current, bobbing and swaying like rudderless ships, the prairie schooners truly lived up to their name. Once safely on the other side, everything was painstakingly reassembled and reloaded again. At some crossings, when wood was available, rafts were frequently assembled. Wagons and supplies floated across on these crude vessels. The animals swam. Soon, in true entrepreneur spirit, ferries and toll bridges began to appear along the trail. Some operators charged the overlanders outrageous fees. Others, like David McCannell's bridge over Rock Creek Station, imposed more modest tolls, anywhere from 10 to 50 cents per wagon, depending upon the ability to pay and the size of the load. Rivers weren't the only obstacle the immigrants had to deal with as they made their way west. The weather was unpredictable at best, and the prairie thunderstorm was a force to be reckoned with.
We had a dreadful storm of rain and hail last night, and very sharp lightning. It killed 2 oxen. The wind was so high I thought it would tear the wagon to pieces. Nothing but the stoutest covers could stand it. Amelia S. Knight, 1853.
Evening temperatures often dipped below freezing, while searing daytime heat sapped energy and blistered lips. In places, there were no trees, no shade, and no breeze, but usually plenty of dust.
The dust was intolerable. In calm weather, it would rise so thick at times that the lead oxen could not be seen from the wagon. Like a London fog, it seemed thick enough to cut. Ezra Meeker, 1852.
The terrain itself posed additional problems. At Windlass Hill, the pioneers locked or chained their wheels. Some tied pine trees to the back of their rigs to slow the descent. Then they lowered the wagons down with ropes. With heels dug in and straining against the weight, they slid and skidded down the steep grade. Even with all their preparation, wagons sometimes broke loose, careening wildly downward. Alkali water was another hazard. It poisoned oxen almost immediately. Without draft animals to pull their heavy loads, the immigrants knew they could be in deep trouble. So thirst-crazed cattle were physically restrained, even beaten off from drinking the tainted water. When efforts failed, dead carcasses unmistakably marked these toxic water holes. In other places, an equally deadly poison lay coiled in wait. Rattlesnakes were a common hazard on the trail. But life on the trail wasn't totally filled with hardship and difficulty. All along the way, the immigrants were captivated by the natural beauty and surprising variety of the American West. At Soda Springs, carbon dioxide-infused water bubbled up from the ground. Today, you can still dip your cup in the same spring water that caused a sensation 150 years ago. At Ayer's Natural Bridge, the overlanders marveled at this red rock formation arching across shimmering Laprelle Creek. The wondrous Thousand Springs originated partially from the subterranean Lost River of eastern Idaho. The immigrants stood transfixed as great volumes of white water emerged from sheer canyon walls and streamed down in lacy ribbons to the Snake River far below. Yet even at these idyllic places, the elephant would still come calling. It happened at Alcove Spring.
We found a large spring of water, as cold and pure as if it had just been melted from ice. It gushed from a ledge of rocks which compose the bank of the stream, and falling some 10 feet, its waters are received into a basin. Edwin Bryant, 1846.
While the men of an 1846 party constructed a raft across the raging Big Blue River at Alcove Spring, Sarah Keyes, a grandmother with the group, died. Her demise was a harbinger of bad luck, for this was the ill-fated Donner Party. When trapped in a blizzard in the Sierra Nevada mountains for months on end, its starving members finally resorted to the unthinkable in order to survive: cannibalism. Although the plight of the Donner Party is well documented, many myths of the Oregon Trail continue to persist. Popular fiction, art, motion pictures, and television have all romanticized life on the trail at the expense of accuracy. Like the misconception that the immigrants rode most of the way. The truth is, most immigrants walked the entire 2,000 miles. The small 10-by-4 prairie schooners were piled high with provisions. There simply wasn't much room for people. Only the sick, some women, and the smallest children rode. Besides, walking was preferred to the bone-jarring ride of the wagons. Another myth concerns the Native Americans. Indians seldom attacked wagon trains during the early years of the migration. All told, there were only a few hundred pioneer deaths in the first 2 decades caused by Indian hostility. In fact, without the help of friendly natives, many immigrants would never have made it to the promised land.
The Indians soon visited and seemed disposed to cultivate a friendly intercourse, which we gave them to understand we appreciated. Seeing we were in need of food, they brought dead prairie dogs and some screech owls. Doubtless these are considered delicacies among them. Samuel Hancock, 1845.
And while the overlanders did draw their wagons into circles, it wasn't to fend off Indian attack. This noontime and evening formation helped control livestock and provide some protection from storms. Long single-file lines of wagons stretching to the horizon are also the product of artistic license. In reality, wagons were more often spread out in width when conditions permitted. No one wanted to choke on dust all day. As the immigrants left the valley of the Little Blue, which had sheltered them since Alcove Spring, they gently climbed to a broad plateau. Here, the rolling prairie slowly changes to a harsher, drier landscape, what the maps of the day referred to as the Great American Desert. Not a true desert, but a desolate land all the same. An area the Omaha Indians called Nebraska, or Land of the Shallow Waters. A land run through by a remarkable river. Some said it was a mile wide and an inch deep. Others claimed it was too thin to plow, too thick to drink. The French named it the Platte, which means flat water. This river was different from the others the immigrants had encountered. No trees lined its banks. The water spilled right out into the prairie, in places spreading 2 to 3 miles wide. Without the Platte, the Great American Desert could never have been crossed, at least not in the 1840s. It was the single most important water source on the trail. In this nearly treeless land, the pioneers would light no cooking fires were it not for the discovery of an entirely different kind of fuel, dried buffalo dung, or as it was politely called, buffalo chips.
The fires burned clear and with great heat, so that by good management with our old-fashioned Dutch ovens and closed kettles, a clean and wholesome meal could be quickly prepared over a fire of buffalo chips. Sarah Cummins, 1845.
What was cooked over these fires was often the same animal that supplied the fuel. Buffalo meat provided a welcome relief from salt pork and bacon. The tongue and hump were considered delicacies. The huge herds of American bison were slaughtered as much for sport as for food. Areas of the prairie were often covered with massive, bloated carcasses rotting in the sun. For the Plains Indian, the Pawnee, Sioux, Arapaho, and Blackfoot, the decimation of this traditional food source was disastrous, for it robbed them not only of their sustenance, but destroyed the very foundation upon which their culture was based. All across the American West, entire bands of Native Americans were additionally wiped out by invisible killers: typhoid, malaria, measles, and smallpox. Diseases unwittingly transmitted by the largely immune immigrants. As these indigenous people began to decline, treaties were signed in which tribes gave up their rights to ancestral lands. For the Native American had no concept of land ownership. By the 1870s, tribal lands had shrunk to a mere fraction of their original size. The Indians finally rebelled, and devastating wars broke out from the 1860s through the 1890s. But it was too late to stem the tide of the Western migration, too late to protect their culture. By the turn of the 20th century, the American Indian population, estimated at 1 million or more before the white man's arrival, had dwindled to 200,000 individuals. Many trails from the jumping-off towns on the Missouri River converged at the Platte, forming the Great Platte River Road. Down this natural corridor rolled the pioneers on their way to a stopover at Fort Kearny. Forts at strategic locations all along the length of the trail were eagerly anticipated. Inside were amenities that soothed the souls of the travel-weary. Surrounded by these protective walls were stores and warehouses, blacksmiths and carpenter shops, a central kitchen, even rooms for rent. Here the overlanders purchased supplies, repaired wagons, shoed animals, and if they were lucky, received letters from home. Today, many of these fortresses have been reconstructed or restored and are open to the public. Some forts were established solely for the protection of the pioneers. Garrisoned with U.S. troops, these solitary outposts were symbols of American interest in Western expansion. Through the Hudson Bay Company, the British had established their own strongholds. With these fur trading posts, the English hoped to retain their claim of prior occupancy to much of the Pacific Northwest. But try as they might, they could not turn back the ever-increasing stream of American immigrants. At Fort Hall, in what would become the state of Idaho, the early settlers were greeted with British hospitality and negativity. The chief trader at the fort, Richard Grant, discouraged the pioneers from continuing to Oregon by wagon. He painted a grim portrait of the dangers and hardship that lie ahead. But these wayfarers were no strangers to adversity. They had come this far and were not changing plans. With each fort along the way, whether American or English, prices crept higher than the last.
Good wagons here bring from $4 to $30. Mules from $100 to $150. Everything you buy costs 4 times as much as it's worth, and everything you sell brings perhaps 1/10 its value. Dr. T, 1849.
Ironically, some of the heftiest price gouging went on at citadels like Fort Laramie, built and run by American trappers and mountain men. Trappers were among the first to explore this vast western frontier, eventually opening it up for the overlanders. Legendary mountain men like Jedediah Smith, Thomas Fitzpatrick, Kit Carson, and Jim Bridger fanned out across this wild empire. They trapped and traded beaver and other animal pelts until the fur trade played itself out in the 1830s. Jim Bridger was the most famous trapper of them all. Although he didn't read words, his keen eyes could read a trail like a book. He discovered the Great Salt Lake and was one of the first white men to travel to South Pass over the Rockies. Later, he became an expert guide for both wagon trains and the military. The mountains were his home, and he never left them until the end, when his famed eyes began to give out. He spent the final years of his life in the jumping-off town of Westport, Missouri, totally blind. Jim Bridger died in 1881, but his legacy lives on as a pathfinder for a trail that bridged half a continent. The route of the Oregon Trail followed the same general course across 6 present-day states. Each morning, gunshots pierced the pre-dawn stillness, signaling the beginning of another day. As the women and children prepared breakfast, the men struck the tents and rounded up the animals. At 7 a.m., the wagons drew into formation, waited for the signal to march, and rolled forward. Another day of the same routine, driving the wagons, scouting ahead. For most, endless walking, step by step, mile after mile. The goal was 20 miles a day, but it was often a struggle to make 15. Laboring up hills and down ravines, slogging through mud or driving through dust took its toll. Rain-swollen rivers, sick or dying animals, broken wagon parts, all conspired against these voyagers. Yet the wagon master's warning to keep it moving propelled them ever onward. Around midday, the party stopped at a nooning area, a time to rest, to eat, and let cattle graze. After lunch, it was off again for more of the same, this time in the heat of the day. Around 6 p.m., the travelers reached overnight camp. Wagons were unpacked and tents once again pitched. The animals were unyoked or unharnessed and led to pasture. If there wasn't any wood available, buffalo chips were collected so dinner could be prepared and ravenous appetites appeased. After dinner, it was time to unwind from the stresses and strains of the day, the time to socialize. Sometimes fiddles and banjos appeared. Soon there was singing, dancing, and storytelling. As the creeping darkness advanced, it was finally time to rest weary bones and dream of journey's end in Oregon. Until morning, when the routine began all over again. Every road has its signposts, its landmarks. The Oregon Trail was no exception. Some were minor stream crossings or obscure water holes. Others were harder to miss. In western Nebraska, the immigrants encountered 2 massive natural monuments standing tall against the hot blue sky: Courthouse Rock and Jail Rock.
The atmosphere in this region is of remarkable clearness, for which cause we were unable to estimate distances with any precision. Courthouse Rock appeared only about 2 miles off, when in reality it was 10 or 12. Alonzo Delano, 1849.
The immigrants couldn't resist exploring these clay and limestone formations, for they were more than the first truly large monuments on the trail. They were portals to a new region. Chimney Rock, nearly 500 miles from Independence, was the most often mentioned landmark in pioneer diaries. The immigrants had read about this structure in their guidebooks, even dreamt about it during those restless weeks before departure. Now, here it was, a solitary beacon confirming that they were on course. The last and largest of the landmarks on this section of the trail was the imposing 800-foot-high Scotts Bluff. The overlanders passed through this seemingly impenetrable wall via Mitchell Pass. Some pioneers climbed to the top of Scotts Bluff. There, they were rewarded with a grand perspective of where they had been and what lay ahead. Along with the families and the adventurers on the trail, there traveled an altogether different group of overlanders, the Mormons. These deeply religious people forged their own trail on the north bank of the Platte to keep apart from the other immigrants and avoid competition for grazing and campsites. They had always kept apart from others whom they viewed as non-believers. Because of this segregation, as well as other elements of their faith, like polygamy, they were persecuted. Led west by Brigham Young in 1846, nearly 60,000 would follow on the Mormon trail during the next 8 years. Some were so poor that they traveled not in wagons, but with their possessions in handcarts. The Mormons eventually prospered in the valley of the Great Salt Lake, but their dreams of keeping their home an independent state failed. Utah Territory was established in 1850 and admitted into the Union in 1896. The Oregon Trail was not a single designated pathway east to west. It changed with each passing year. In some areas, it spread miles wide as the immigrants searched for fresh water, firewood, and grazing land.
Grass is scarce and seems to be getting more and more scarce the further we go, having been used up by those ahead of us. We were obliged to drive our cattle 3 miles from camp tonight to obtain any grass whatever for them. Enoch W. Conyers, 1852.
In other places, the trail narrowed to a single track due to geography. Thousands of wagons cut into the sandstone near Guernsey, Wyoming. These ruts are 6 feet deep in places. Erosion, farmers' plows, irrigation, and highway projects have all but taken their toll on the ruts of the Oregon Trail. It is estimated that no more than 20% of these historic grooves remain. But today, through increasing preservation efforts, the ruts and swales of 150 years ago are still visible in many places throughout the trail states. All along the trail, immigrants scratched their names into every conceivable surface, leaving their mark for posterity. Much of this pioneer graffiti has eroded over the years, but in the soft, easily engraved rock of Register Cliff, these names are still remarkably preserved today. Like some giant tortoise sprawled across the barren plain, Independence Rock, with its hard granite surface, proved more difficult for immigrants to inscribe, but it didn't stop them.
We found the rock literally covered with the names of immigrants. Some of these names were written with white or red chalk. Some were cut in the rock with a cold chisel, whilst others were written in with tar. Enoch W. Conyers, 1852.
As the trail grew rougher and increasingly difficult to navigate, those who had not heeded their guide's advice to take only the absolute necessities began to lighten their loads. Even precious food was cast aside to ease the burden of straining oxen.
Trunks, clothes, mattresses, quilts, beef, bacon, rice, augers, handsaws. These were thrown out yesterday by one train in order to make their loads lighter. Dr. T, 1849.
In mean-spirited efforts, some made sure others could not use what they discarded by first destroying it. Others, more charitably inclined, left notes on pristine items directing those who found them to help themselves. After the barren, hellish landscape leading up to Independence Rock, the immigrants reached a river with water that seemed to flow from heaven itself, the Sweetwater.
Why this stream is called Sweetwater, I don't know. But after being obliged to drink alkali water and the roily water from the River Platte most of the way, it certainly causes this pure mountain water to taste very sweet indeed.
Following the Sweetwater River, the trail narrowed as it drew closer to the Rocky Mountains. Immediately ahead, a V-shaped cleavage in the rock towered 500 feet over the surging Sweetwater, Devil's Gate. To many immigrants, it was an inspiration, something out of a heroic legend or a dream. And further along, a smaller echo of Devil's Gate, Split Rock. Miles away in the Rattlesnake Range, 1,100 feet above the valley floor, it marked the way to South Pass. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the overlanders had been rising in elevation ever since leaving Independence. Dazzled by the sights of the last 100 miles, they were upon South Pass before they realized it. With the Wind River Range still high above them, this broad, 20-mile wide, 7,800-foot-high saddle didn't seem like a mountain pass. But they had indeed crested the top of the Rocky Mountains. Now, for the first time, streams flowed away from the Pilgrims toward the Columbia and the distant Pacific. They had come 1,000 miles, navigated the backbone of the continent, and were now halfway to Oregon. Throughout the early years of the trail, the destination of most wagon trains was the Willamette Valley in the Oregon country. By 1848, nearly 12,000 people had immigrated there via the Oregon Trail. But in that year of 1848, something happened that would change the course of immigration forever. It was discovered along the American River at John Sutter's Ranch in the Sacramento Valley of California. Gold. Suddenly, the Oregon fever broke, only to be replaced by a far greater delirium. Gold fever. This new wave of immigrants included adventurers, gamblers, and troublemakers. In a hurry to make their fortune, they constantly scouted for shortcuts. The Oregon Trail became crisscrossed with bypasses. The most widely used were Sublet's Cutoff, Hudspeth Cutoff, and the California Cutoff. The very next year, more than 25,000 Argonauts flooded into California. By 1850, the figure had doubled again to 50,000. In the remaining years of the migration, 8 out of every 10 people on the Oregon Trail headed to California. Some struck it rich. Others returned home penniless. Many stayed and created a dynamic state. After crossing South Pass, the immigrants followed another major river of the Oregon Trail. The Snake River was sometimes wide and smooth, but more often a twisting, violent tempest that thrashed through rapids and slashed out canyons. These sheer walls cut off the river from livestock and pioneers alike. Searching for a crossing of the Snake, the Oregon-bound wagons traveled over a brutal landscape of sand, sage, and lava deposits. At one point, the trail passed through a narrow breach in the rocks, the remnant of an extinct volcano. In 1862, a wagon train was attacked near here by Shoshone Indians. Today, the area is an Idaho State Park called Massacre Rocks. Soon after departing this volcanic landscape, the immigrants found their ford, a place where 3 islands spread across a wide stretch of the Snake like stepping stones, offering protection from the full force of the unpredictable current. This was the most difficult and dangerous river crossing on the entire trail, 3 Island Crossing.
We forded the Snake River, which runs so swift that the drivers, 4 to a team, had to hold on to the ox yokes to keep from being swept down by the current. The water came into the wagon boxes, and after making the island, we raised the boxes on blocks. Elizabeth Wood, 1851.
Those who crossed here reached an easier route on the other side. They soon arrived at another Hudson Bay enclave, Fort Boise. Here, near the mouth of the Boise River, a ferry was eventually constructed, charging an outrageous $8 per wagon to cross the raging Snake one final time. Now the overlanders entered what is today the state of Oregon. They traveled up Keeney Pass, crossed the Malheur River, and took one final look at the Snake from a campground called Farewell Bend. Those who had made good time to this point were becoming excited, for they now faced the last leg of their long journey. Those who started late or became delayed by accident or illness were nervous. Ahead lie the Blue Mountains. Would they be blue or white with snow? Through rugged Burnt River Canyon they rode, crossing the stream time and time again. Then the long haul up Immigrant Gulch. The answer was clear as they rounded Flagstaff Hill. With the Baker Valley spread out before them, there in the distance loomed the Blues. These were the first true forests since Missouri. For all their worry, all the warnings, the Blue Mountains proved relatively easy-going after what the immigrants had been through. The climb was steep and rough, but there was plenty of wood, water, and grass.
We ascended the Blue Mountains. Our course was south of west and descended into a deep hole, for it was down and up again in the midst of a forest of pine, spruce, and balsam, though not like the forests in the States. The ground is covered with tall grass and weeds, making the woods beautiful to travel in. Reverend W.H. Gray, 1838.
As they reached the 4,200-foot summit, they emerged from the tall timber and witnessed a vast panorama of dry, rolling hills spreading out before them. In the early days of the migration, the immigrants traveled to the Whitman Mission on the Walla Walla River in today's Washington state. They were greeted with warmth and hospitality by the missionary and physician, Dr. Marcus Whitman, and his wife, Narcissa. Ever since their first encounter with Lewis and Clark, some Native Americans had expressed interest in the white man's medicine or power. Religious authorities interpreted this as a cry from the wilderness for spiritual help. Missionaries of every persuasion set out to Christianize the so-called savages. Some missionaries were well-intentioned. Others were more concerned with personal gain than souls. In 1836, Dr. Whitman and his wife took a wagon across the Great Divide. Narcissa was the first white woman to travel what would become the Oregon Trail. From their mission, they began to minister to the local Cayuse Indians. Then, in 1847, tragedy struck. The Cayuse, dying from an epidemic of black measles, blamed Dr. Whitman for his inability to cure them. In a bloody attack, the natives murdered the doctor, Narcissa, and 12 others. Without this refuge, later immigrants traveled a new route overland from the Blues and beyond Cayuse territory. They rambled over mile after mile of the same dry, hilly terrain, crossing the Umatilla, the John Day, and the Deschutes rivers. At this point, many were out of food, out of energy, and out of hope. Just when all seemed lost, something miraculous occurred.
When on rising a sandy hill, the noble Columbia at once burst upon our view, I could scarcely repress a loud exclamation of delight and pleasure as I gazed upon the magnificent river, flowing silently and majestically on, and reflected that I had actually crossed the vast American continent and now stood upon a stream that poured its waters directly into the Pacific. John K. Townsend, 1834.
Just as the Missouri River marked the beginning of their journey, now this great river of the West signaled the end, or almost the end. As they pulled into the Dalles, the immigrants faced one final decision, one last fork in the road. They could float down the river on rafts or take the Barlow Toll Road around the perpetually snow-capped Mount Hood.
We took off our wagon wheels, laid them on the raft, placed the wagon beds on them, and started. There were 3 families of us, on 12 logs, 18 inches through and 40 feet long. The water runs 3 inches over our raft. Elizabeth Gear, 1847.
It was now October, the rainy season. Those that chose river passage floated downstream until they reached the treacherous cascades of the Columbia. These terrifying rapids forced them to portage along the mud-infused banks. Here, nearly to the end of their long journey, the elephant brought tragedy anew.
Just above the Cascade Mountains, one of our boats, containing 6 persons, was caught in one of those terrible whirlpools and upset. My son, 10 years old, my brother Jesse's son, Edward, same age, were lost. Lindsay Applegate, 1843.
Calmer waters prevailed as they put back into the river and passed through the spectacular Columbia River Gorge. Some, too weary from 2,000 miles of travel, were numb to the grandeur. Others marveled at the sights. When they reached Fort Vancouver, headquarters of the Hudson Bay Company in the Northwest, the chief factor, Dr. John McLaughlin, welcomed the tattered and threadbare immigrants. This strong-willed Scotsman, although an agent of the Crown, provided credit, food, jobs, and passage down the Willamette River to Journey's End. Back at the Dalles, those choosing the Barlow Toll Road headed south, then up the Tye Valley, moving ever closer to the white giant, Mount Hood. Blazed in 1845 by Joel Palmer and Sam Barlow, who said, "God never made a mountain without leaving a pass through it." The Barlow Road turned west through a toll gate and into the forest.
I am weary of this journey, weary of myself and all around me. I long for the quiet of home where I can be at peace once more. Agnes Stewart, 1853.
Thick, rain-soaked woods, unfamiliar plants, and muffled sounds lent an eerie quality to their journey. Glimpses of ghostly Mount Hood peeking through the massive trees nudged them on. It was a tough pull up Barlow Pass, but the road posed no real problems until the immigrants came upon one final obstacle. Their hearts sank at Laurel Hill.
The road on this hill is something terrible. It is worn down into the soil from 5 to 7 feet, leaving steep banks along both sides, and so narrow that it is almost impossible to walk alongside of the cattle for any distance without leaning against the oxen. Enoch W. Conyers, 1852.
They had no choice. Locking wheels and snubbing ropes to trees, they lowered their wagons over the edge. Most made it down. Now, except for a few small streams, it was over. As the pioneers exited the western toll gate and descended the valley to Oregon City, they slowly realized they had finally arrived. After 2,000 miles and 6 months of grueling life on the road, they had reached their goal.
We arrived at Oregon City, the place of our destination. Here we were able to procure such things as were really necessary to make us comfortable, and were happy after a long and tedious tour over mountains and deserts through a wild and savage wilderness to witness the home of civilization and to enjoy the warm welcome of countrymen and friends. Overton Johnson, 1843.
Those who intended to cultivate the soil laid claims, built cabins, and prepared for the coming winter. All found enough to do. Everyone seemed satisfied for a time with being permitted to have a home and a plentiful subsistence. W.H. Winter, 1843.
Even the last year's immigrants, some of whom have not been more than 9 or 10 months on their new farms, have plenty for themselves, and some to spare for their countrymen now on the way. Of bread, beef, fish, and potatoes of a superior kind, we have plenty. James Clyman, 1845.
The long distance that separated us from our old home in the Mississippi Valley precluded any form of homesickness, and our united efforts were wholly set upon the building of a home. Sarah Cummins, 1845.
The largest voluntary migration in human history brought more than 300,000 people to western destinations. In the 1870s, new tracks closely followed the route blazed by these pioneers would bring even more. With steel rails and iron horses imprinting the land, the Transcontinental Railroad soon replaced wagon travel, and the Oregon Trail began to fade. Today, interstate highways parallel the remnants of the Oregon Trail. What once took 6 months to navigate can now be traveled by car in a few days. But those who come to trace this history learn to take their time. They discover that there is more here than just these ruts, these swales, these graves. More than immigrant campgrounds and forts, river crossings and cutoffs. More than a mere road. Many come to understand that the Oregon Trail is an attitude, a state of mind, an indomitable spirit of independence and adventure. A willingness to set goals, take risks, and reach out for a dream. Putting faith in one's ability to overcome any obstacle and in the end emerge victorious. Today, we are still a country of movement and change, uprooting our lives to find better opportunities and new beginnings. This has always been the promise of America. This is our legacy, our gift from those who went before us, west to Oregon.